to address its impact upon the climate and cut its carbon footprint. It's why the world's airlines have set tough CO2 targets. We are the first industry to call for a global cross-border agreement to reduce CO2 emissions. Under CORSIA, almost all growth in international flying will be carbon neutral from 2020 through CO2 offsets.
The negotiations on CORSIA were very difficult, with some countries saying, we cannot meet a 2020 target, our airlines need to grow in the future. And others saying, if we cannot limit the carbon dioxide emissions of our aircraft, the future of our industry is in jeopardy.
Some airlines also offer voluntary offsetting programs, so passengers and businesses can reduce their carbon footprint.
Some people say the answer is to offset these emissions, and that's when you pay someone else to reduce their CO2 instead. So if I wanted to offset my flights, is it the same for me to pay towards some solar panels in India as it is to plant some trees here in Britain?
There are problems, to be honest, in both types of approaches. There is kind of offset that involves paying for measures that will help reduce emissions from some other activity, usually elsewhere in the world.
Carbon offsets are not the perfect solution. They're concerned about the long-term effectiveness. We need evidence that programs are being implemented as promised. Even advocates of carbon offsets say they must be accompanied by more far-reaching innovation, such as sustainable aviation fuels made from household waste and biomass. There's huge potential to repurpose what we throw away in cutting-edge technology to create sustainable fuels.
Anything you throw in your black bag, so nappies, plastic, cardboard, food, anything that can't be recycled, we'll take that and we'll turn it into sustainable aviation fuel.
Take-up of sustainable fuels on a significant scale is being hampered by a lack of current capacity. Satisfying global demand requires much larger investment from the big oil producers to increase production. Making flying environmentally sustainable requires even greater technological leadership. Revolutionizing an entire mode of travel takes time and collaboration. We're getting closer. Planes have looked roughly the same since the days of the Comet and the 707, which may hide how technology has changed. New materials mean the fuselage and interiors are much lighter, reducing weight and fuel use. The next generation will have the biggest impact on our global CO2 footprint. Manufacturers are designing electric and hybrid planes with new types of generators, batteries and turbines. But there will be small aircraft and are at least 15 years away from commercial service. They're not a solution in the short term. We understand the global climate change crisis and the urgent need to reduce our footprint. But the choice to fly in protection of our environment cannot be an either-or dilemma. CO2 is the problem, not travel. To cut emissions and continue flying is a transformational challenge ahead of us.
So as you can see from that, it's a complex issue. Even the solutions have complexities amongst them. And what we're going to try and do over the next few hours is to take you through some of those discussions with people that are actually involved in helping this industry to deal with its climate responsibility. And all with a singular focus, which is our 3 targets. So improving fuel efficiency by 1.5% annually to 2020, by achieving carbon neutral growth from 2020, and by really aiming all of our resources that we could possibly muster towards having the industry cut its emissions to half of 2005 levels by 2050. And I think over the next few hours, you'll start to understand what a difficult challenge that is, and also some of the progress that we're making towards that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael Gill, who's going to lead you through the first discussion. Michael's our Director of Environment. He's also the Executive Director of the Air Transport Action Group. And that regrouping is a really great example of how the industry is tackling this as a unified entity. It's not just airlines, it's the manufacturers, it's the air navigation service providers, it's the airports, and we're all coming together through ATAG and Michael's leadership to help us address this issue. So without further ado, Michael.
very much. Good morning, everybody. As Tony said, this is a really exciting opportunity for a number of industry stakeholders to come and talk with you about, as Tony said, the challenges that we're facing in putting in place the strategy that we adopted as an industry back in 2009. But also, and I think more importantly, some of the real progress that's been made and some of the exciting plans that are in place across the sector. So you're going to hear over the course of this morning from a number of different players focusing in on some of the very detailed topics. So we hope this is a very informative and rich session for you. There's lots of information to take on board, but I think it's an important time to be doing that, and so delighted to be with you, and hope that you find this as interesting as we've tried to make it. Our first session this morning is going to be looking at developments around the issue of offsetting, and we've got two expert speakers to present to you. Michel Adam is the Senior Manager for Aviation Environment Policy at IATA. He's going to talk about the CORSIA agreement and how that's going to make a difference as far as our industry's climate commitments are concerned. And Kai Landwehr from My Climate in Zurich, he's the head of marketing. He's going to discuss offsetting in general terms, the kind of schemes that are in place, and issues around trust, transparency, public interest in the issue that is a big focus for the sector. Now, before they get into the discussion at hand, I just wanted to flag up one very exciting and very new development from an IATA perspective. We're delighted to announce this morning that IATA is about to partner with a carbon exchange solution provider called CBL Markets. They're an ex-CHG company. That's to assist airlines in their upcoming CORSIA carbon offset compliance. The exchange solution which we're looking to put in place will make sure that airlines invest in CORSIA eligible carbon credits. Those credits will be listed on an exchange just as soon as ICAO is in a position to publish the list of credits accepted under the scheme. And I'm sure our presenters this morning will explain the ICAO process that is in place. Along with some existing programs in the IATA portfolio, the exchange is going to allow for CORSIA compliance, which is a really big milestone for the airlines on the climate action journey towards the commitments which we've described. So there will be trialling with airlines who are interested in supporting that program, beginning to offset credits through this exchange in the first quarter of 2020. So it's a very exciting development. Just wanted to flag that up with you. And of course, there will be more news in next year as that solution is fully implemented. So without further ado, I'm delighted to invite to the stage Michel and Kai, who are going to give you their presentations, and then we'll open it to the floor for all your questions. Thank you.
Good morning. Yes. Good morning, everyone. As Michael mentioned, I'll take you through a bit of the sort of background information on CORSIA, where we are, why it is important for the industry. And there's one slide that we very often show, and maybe some of you have seen it already, but it's actually a critical slide, critical chart to understand where CORSIA fits in our strategy. We've heard before that the industry has adopted targets. We've actually adopted those targets 10 years ago. One is a fuel efficiency target, which runs until 2020. More interestingly is the CNG 2020, so capping our net emissions at the levels of 2020. And this is very much what CORSIA is about. And then in the longer term, we have a target to cut our emissions by half, and it's important to underline compared to 2005. And very often when we talk about the short-term fuel efficiency target, carbon neutral growth, I think it's critical, especially now with all the attention on CORSIA, that we keep in mind they're not enough, and I think the industry understands that very well. They're not enough. We need to go below the levels where they were in 2005, and that's why our long-term target is absolutely critical. But allow me maybe to come back to sort of the imminent target, which is carbon neutral growth from 2020. As you will see throughout the day, our industry relies heavily, naturally, on measures which reduce the emissions that comes out of the aircraft, that improve the efficiency of aircraft, of air travel. However, and that was recognized from the start, those in-sector measures are not going to be sufficient, at least in the short to medium term, to reach our targets. And that's why from the start, there has been a recognition that we needed a carbon pricing instrument to help us achieve our targets. And we very often forget one thing about CORSIA. CORSIA is a carbon pricing instrument. It's actually the first carbon pricing instrument which was adopted for a single sector at a global level. And there are three things which are absolutely important to keep in mind when we talk about CORSIA. The first one, and for those who have been involved in the process in ICAO that led to the adoption of it, getting 193 states, governments, to agree on a global carbon pricing instrument is not a small thing. It's a very challenging task. They have very different priorities in terms of economic development, in terms of the environment. So being able to get them to agree on one scheme is a significant achievement, and it should not be underestimated. For many, CORSIA carbon neutral growth is not enough. For others, it's too ambitious, but I think what matters is that CORSIA is going to mitigate CO2 emissions. ICAO forecasts that the mitigation would be around 2.5 billion tons over the next 15 years, which is very significant. And that mitigation will be achieved through climate finance. And if you take the 2.5 billion tons as your benchmark, as your mitigation, that represents roughly 40 billion US dollars that will go into climate projects. The other element which is absolutely critical is CORSIA is a compliance scheme. It's not a voluntary scheme, it's not something that you can either participate in or not. Airlines will have to comply with CORSIA, and they will have to use emissions units or carbon offsets which have been approved by experts from states. An airline is not free to pick whichever offset they think looks good. They will have to pick from the offsets that will have been evaluated, audited, according to strict criteria which have been agreed in ICAO by experts from states. So that's very important to keep in mind as well when we talk about offsetting in the context of CORSIA. And the third point, which I can never emphasize enough, yes, there's a lot of attention on CORSIA, but for the industry, the priority remains in sector reductions. When an airline emits 1 ton of CO2, it's actually burning $200 worth of fuel. So there's a very strong incentive for the airlines from a financial perspective, firstly, to reduce their fuel consumption, which has a direct impact on CO2 emissions. And obviously, the industry is well aware of its responsibility to mitigate its impact. So the priority for the airlines remains in sector reductions. Offsetting comes after to compensate for what the airlines could not achieve otherwise. The third point, when we talk about carbon pricing, when we talk about economic measures, is to look at which measures are actually delivering mitigation. We hear a lot, we've been hearing a lot recently that aviation needs to be taxed, aviation is the only way to drive emissions down. But when you think about it a bit more closely, how does a tax work? A ticket tax typically would try to deter people from traveling. That's how it works. So what will be the impact if you take it one step further? You'll have fewer passengers. An airline will have then fewer passengers to put on the aircraft. either the flight remains profitable and they will continue operating. Operating a flight with 110 or 113 passengers on board emits exactly the same CO2. You might have a few grams less, but it's not something significant. If a flight is strategic for the airline in order to keep market shares, it will also continue operating the flight. You'll keep the same emissions. Now, you may have situations where the drop in passenger numbers may mean that an airline will cancel their flight, which is when you actually get a reduction in CO2 emissions. But do you really think that the airline is just going to park the aircraft in a garage somewhere and leave it there? No, the airline is going to use it for other markets. And that will just keep the emissions there. So taxes will not drive emissions down. They may shift traffic to other destinations, to other markets. They may make flying actually less efficient because you'll have fewer passengers on board, but they will not decarbonize the sector. And I think that's very important to keep in mind when we talk about solutions, actual solutions to address our challenge of climate change. The other point, which is critical if we want to be effective in tackling the climate change impact of aviation, is to keep a global perspective. We see a lot of pressure in some regions, fair enough, but if those regions sort of detach from the global community, detach from the other states, you may end up with reductions in markets where growth is actually not important, leaving other states behind where the future growth of air travel, and therefore also emissions from air travel, is going to be much more significant. In Europe, we're talking roughly about an increase of 1 to 2% in the number of trips per passenger, per person. Once you start looking towards developing countries, emerging markets, it's a very different picture. If you look at India or China, we're talking about 10%, 11% increase. That's 11 times 10 times what we have in Europe. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind when we commit to tackling the challenge of climate change, that we shouldn't have sort of a regional look at it, but keep a global perspective. Which is, I think, one of our key concerns. Our key concern is really that the global approach through a UN agency such as ICAO must remain a priority. And that goes through a few steps. First, obviously, we need states to commit on CORSIA. That means full implementation by all ICAO member states of the agreement that they agreed to a couple of years ago. We need actually ICAO to finalize a few elements. We'll probably talk about sustainable aviation fuels later, but there are a few additional criteria that need to be finalized in ICAO. We need ICAO, and that's fundamental, to go through the assessment process for the carbon offsets which will be eligible, to make sure that they deliver on the environmental integrity that is needed. We're now in Geneva, but as you all know, there are many discussions going on right now in Madrid for the COP meeting. Those discussions are actually some of the discussions happening in Madrid are very important for ICAO. They cannot be solved by ICAO, but they will affect us. And that's notably the discussions under Article 6, which will define which, at least some of the offsets that will be eligible and how we can make sure that they're counted right. This is something that needs to be solved in Madrid, and which is critical for us. And then the last point, which I will really emphasize, is that the industry has a long-term goal for aviation, the minus 50% compared to 2005, but governments haven't agreed yet on such a goal. And as I've emphasized, it's really important we have a global approach, we have a global commitment to address emissions from international aviation, and that will go through an agreement on a long-term goal for the sector. And finally, having a global approach is great, but it has to be supported by effective policies at the national level. And that goes through delivering on infrastructure, ATM reforms. The way you fly aircraft has a huge impact on emissions. Many of you, as you were flying into Geneva, may have noted on the small maps that you have made huge detours, that you didn't take a straight road from your origin to your destination. Obviously, in many cases that burns more fuel. We need to have better infrastructure in order to minimize emissions as well. And we need a lot of support for the uptake in sustainable aviation fuels and technology, but I'm sure we'll come back to that later today. And then when we're looking at carbon pricing at the national level, it is absolutely critical that what states put in place for domestic aviation is compatible and supports what we have agreed at the global level with CORSIA. So I'll leave it to that.
Hello, welcome from my side as well. Thank you for having me here. So basically, I want to talk about three aspects of climate protection today. So first of all, I want to show and explain the concept of offsetting and the reasons for offsetting and also the boundaries of offsetting. Then I want to touch on some concrete carbon offset projects as well as on some concrete global challenge which will be tackled by carbon offset projects. And then I want to leave this, I want to make the work a bit easier for Michael later. I want to leave you some food for thoughts of starting points for the discussions for key factors for effective climate protection within that. So first of all, I will just give some very, very brief information about My Climate in case that you haven't heard about our organization before. We are a Swiss-based foundation founded in 2002. We offer a large variety of climate protection and sustainability services, and our 80 employees serving clients, private people, as well as SMEs and large international corporations from our office in Zurich. But the most important thing, and I think it's the reason why I'm here, we are a forerunner and a pioneer in the system of voluntary carbon offsetting, and we have a track record of 17 years. And we have 100 projects actually in our portfolio in more than 30 countries. So carbon offsetting, what is it and how does it work? So first of all, it's the question of the mindset. So we see carbon offsetting, the problem, the challenge of CO2 emissions, we see this as a garbage disposal problem. And we face these garbage disposal problems. We face it a few times in Switzerland and Western societies on a global level. So you can see this with the wastewater. These are real pictures from Switzerland, unbelievable. So it's not that long ago that we had a large wastewater problem. It's even not long ago that we had a problem with household waste, household garbage. So, but we could solve these problems. How did we do this? We set up a regulatory framework, and we put a price on it. We invented a polluters pay principle, and this helped to effectively solve these garbage disposal problems, and also gave companies here in Switzerland and also in some other countries a competitive advantage on the global markets. Swiss waste management companies are world leaders. So, but how is the situation with CO2 emissions today? We don't have a compliant polluters pay principle in place. And this is what offsetting is meant to be. So carbon offsetting is CO2 emissions produced on one place at one place are reduced at another place. That's it. In terms of the climate protection, in terms of CO2 emissions, you have to think about a global budget. We have a global budget of CO2 emissions of tons of CO2 left. If we emit CO2 emissions at one place, take this out of the budget, and if we have polluters pay principles and we can avoid or reduce CO2 emissions at another place, the balance, it stays in balance, the budget stays in balance. This is the system. And also, which is very important, maybe we'll touch on this later, with carbon offset and carbon offset projects, according to highest standards, there are large co-benefits, socio-economic and socio-ecological co-benefits connected. So, is carbon offsetting, is it the silver bullet for tackling climate change or for tackling even the climate change problem in the aviation industry? Certainly it is an impactful and measurable system we can give in place. And what does this system do? It buys us, it gives us time before we are ready to decarbonize our economy and our society. We have seen it in the movie before. There are solutions for clean and sustainable aviations outside, but it will take at least 15 years before they are market ready. So carbon offsetting can buy us time, and carbon offsetting, there should be a time, and the earlier the better, and there's no need for carbon offsetting any longer. So carbon offsets, how do they concretely work? So this is our portfolio of carbon offset projects. I told you 100 projects in more than 30 countries following 10 technologies. So carbon offset project basically replaces fossil fuels, fossil energy with renewable ones. So we are talking about hydropower, we are talking about solar power, wind, and very important biomass solutions. Or it improves the use of the energy. So there's a large range of our projects which are efficient cook stove projects. I will talk about this later, very important. And also, yes, we've seen this in the video before as well, it's about planting trees. So there are also reforestation projects and soil improvement projects capturing CO2 emissions out of the atmosphere. There might be also technical solutions, but we don't focus on these right now. So carbon offset projects. So what are the main quality criteria for carbon offset projects? These are basically these 6 criteria. So first of all, carbon offset projects has to effectively reduce CO2 emissions, effectively and measurable. This measurement has to be externally certified. So you need to have companies, institutions, trustworthy third parties who can verify and certify these emissions. They have to be transparent. So not only the impact in reducing CO2 emissions, but also the impact of the project itself, the impact of the local economies. They have to be visible and transparently communicated. They have to be additional. This is a killer criterion for carbon offset project. It wouldn't make any sense to support any projects which would work from an economic perspective as well. So you don't need to create an additional income stream for this sustainable project. So this project has to have a financial gap, and carbon finance can help filling this gap. And this, for us, it's very important, and I think we will discuss it when we talk about COSA later. They have to follow quality criteria. There are a lot of standards, there are a lot of different certificates in the market, and we follow, with our project, we follow the highest standards. So our projects follow the gold standard CDM, which is standard by the UN, set up together with some NGOs, and for reforestation projects, the Plan standard. So these standards guarantee the additionality, but they also guarantee the 6th aspect that these projects are sustainable above the reduction of CO2 emissions, so that these projects have large environmental and social co-benefits. And we hope, and this is our strong hope, that also for the CORSIA system, that they will focus on very high quality certificates. So what are the global challenges tackled by carbon offset projects? I will focus on 2. The first one is the challenge of clean cooking. So you see this number here, it's a number from WHO, World Health Organizations. 4 million people die each and every year prematurely by diseases caused by indoor air pollutions, mainly by the smoke of firewood. So, and efficient cook stove projects tackle these challenge. And you see the figures below. These are not the recent figures. I think in my climate history with our projects, we distributed and purchased and sold around 800,000 efficient cook stove or solar cook stove or biodigesters, and we helped and we improved the health situation of around 4 million people worldwide. Second, huge global challenge. It's connected. It's the challenge of global deforestation. Each and every year we lose almost equal the area of Switzerland of global forest. And one of the main drivers of global deforestation is the private use of firewood and producing charcoal. So what we did, we planted around 4 million trees which is very good. It's always a good idea to plant a tree, but I think more important, by the distribution of these efficient cooking systems, we put the pressures on local forests. It's very important. So I will show you just two concrete examples of projects. So first of all, this is one biogas project we started recently in Cambodia. Local families in rural areas, they can buy to an affordable price, but still an investment for these families. You can buy a biogas plant, and this biogas plant is fed with the dung of the animals of these farmer families, as well as with other organic wastes. And so within the biogas, there's methane gas. Methane gas is created, and with the help of this gas, these people can cook each and every day with a clean energy source. So you see, it's tackling, I think, 8 or 9 of the SDGs, because it's not only CO2 emissions which will be reduced, it's not only putting pressure away from the local forest, it's also creating income opportunities, creating opportunities for more education for these families. So biodigesters is a very, very good and very efficient solution. Another of the projects, this is our community reforestation project in Nicaragua. There we are partnering with farmer communities. So in these farmers, they plant trees on parts of their land which is not used for raising crop. So there's no competition between raising crops and reducing CO2 emissions. And the important thing is the growth of the trees will be monitored each and every year, because a tree needs time, even in the equatorial region. It will take even more time here, or even more time than in the UK, as we have seen in the movie, to capture enough CO2 out of the air. So if the trees are growing, these farmer families get additional support. Also, one of the very important co-benefits, so it strengthens the resilience there in these regions, so it prevents these regions with less flooding, etc. So, coming to the end of my input, the key factors for effective climate protection, because when we talk about offsetting, and we have a track record of 17 years from now, it's still just a very small percentage of services and goods which are offset. Fortunately, these numbers are growing, and these numbers are growing heavily within the last year. But anyway, it's still a small percentage. So what is needed to make this proven and measurable instrument even stronger? So these are key factors. First one is trust. The project has to be trustworthy, and also the calculation methods have to be trustworthy. And this requires strong, offensive, and transparent communications from the providers and from the partner sides, from the aviation industry, for instance. Second one, this is also, I think, discussed actually in Madrid with the discussion on the Article 6, is the integrity of the projects. The project has to be on a social level and on an environmental level. You have to have integrity. So it wouldn't make any sense to set up large-scale projects which have negative impact on local societies. So environmental and social integrity is also a key factor. The third one is offsetting has become a commodity. Still today, it is not very comfortable, it's not easily accessible for customers to offset. And we are able to integrate a lot of services in purchasing and booking processes. We are able to integrate dietary requirements, we are able to integrate insurance services. Why are we not able to integrate in a smooth way these environmental services like the Edelweiss airline did? So that you can see this here on the picture. So this could raise, I think, the participation rate. And finally, and we're talking about COSIA, talking about the Paris Agreement, we have to have a strong regulatory framework in place, guaranteeing highest standards, highest environmental, highest social, highest economic standards, which also avoids double or multi-counting of the CO2 emissions reduced, or even guarantee a transparent communication. And finally, which puts projects with negative impact or not trustworthy players out of the market. So that was my input. Thank you for your attention.
thank you, Kai. Thank you, Michelle. So the floor's open. Any questions? If you could mention your name and your organisation. This gentleman at the front.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Could I though just pick up, Michael, what you said? So, just from memory, I don't have the slide in front of me anymore, but you said you saw a scenario where tax would drive down demand without any response in capacity. Basically, you're saying that an airline seeing lower demand would just take that capacity and put it somewhere else. But surely, you know, I mean, even the report that you published yesterday, that IATA published yesterday, demonstrates how airlines are actually very good at cutting capacity in order to correspond to demand. They do park planes, in fact, contrary to what you said, and they do displace older planes and all sorts of planes they pay. So if the source of lower demand is tax, rather than, say, a downturn in the economy, why do you think that airlines would not respond in just the same economically logical way?
They will obviously respond, but I'm not convinced that they will respond by stopping their business. As you said, I think they're driven also by economic considerations. If they have an opportunity to use their equipment, their aircraft, and allocate it to another market where they would remain profitable, then they will do so. And I think it's important. I think I would agree with your view if we had a global tax. Yes, because you cannot avoid it in any way. But let's take the example of the tax which is being proposed in Switzerland. I think it's a very good example of that. If you're an airline which is based in another region, you're flying to Switzerland, you see a drop in the demand for flights to and from Switzerland, will you just park your aircraft? No, you will not. As a passenger, many passengers will say, well, flying out of Zurich now is very expensive. But I can actually take the train to take a flight in Basel, where the tax will not apply. So you will end up with a shift in traffic. Fair enough, you may see some dampening over the course of things, but believing that if you introduce a tax that reduces demand by 10%, you'll have a drop in 10% in emissions is not realistic when you take those economic considerations, which you flag as sort of the way forward.
I'm totally sorry, can I just press you though? So you're saying there's a tax, therefore people stop flying on a particular route, the airline takes that plane and puts it on another route which is profitable. But that route has already got a plane flying on it. So now you've got two planes flying on that route. Or the first plane displaces the second plane, or there is some net reduction to take account. Do you have an example of where an airline would just blindly maintain capacity regardless of demand?
I'm not going to give you a specific example, but you get new markets, you create demand as well. You can create demand. So I'm as I said, you thinking you have a one-to-one relationship is I think not the way it's going to work. And I think ultimately what we want to do is tackle emissions, right? That's the objective. It's not telling people not to fly or not to travel. It's not cutting their freedom to travel. I think the aim is to cut their emissions. If there are more effective ways of cutting emissions, then isn't that where the priority should be? If we can maintain the same flow of passengers, but have quantified, measurable emissions reductions, then that's what we should focus on.
The next question, this gentleman here, trying to focus on the offsetting part, bearing in mind we have our offsetting expert here.
Andreas Spiegel, German aviation journalist. Two questions, one more general question. The industry in general, and also our debate today, is really focusing on CO2 only, but there's so many other emissions of aviation that also needs to be tackled at some point. I wonder, when is that going to happen? When will the single focus on CO2 be overcome, and also like NOx and other things will be tackled? Second question is for my climate. I think you've been working with many airlines for a long time. I think Swiss and Lufthansa have been partners of yours. so far the uptake of voluntary passenger compensation has been extremely low. I wonder how you try to maybe tackle that and find a way to get more passengers to sign up for free, or if the way to go is that EasyJet does now and promises an airline-wide automatic compensation. Thanks.
Shall very briefly on the first, and then I over to you on the offsetting.
I'm not an engineer, but I think it's worth flagging that we're now seeing initiatives. Indeed, a good example I think is contrails, where the scientific understanding of the impacts is increasing and getting a bit clearer. And there we're seeing initiatives from airlines to reach better understand how those contrails can be mitigated through operational measures, for example. So we're seeing that happen indeed, and more focus on the other impacts and not just CO2.
Maybe I can add also one aspect to these questions. So when we talk about CO2 emissions, so basically we calculate CO2 equivalents. So we take these into account, but also this is the focus on trust. We need to come to a global way of calculating this. So in calculating these effects, so some take factors of 2, some of 3, some of 1. So this doesn't really help, but it's very important and important question. And also there's a very interesting project from the DLR in Germany focusing on this. I think we have heard about this. So the second question, yes, we partner with these mentioned airlines, with the Swiss and the Lufthansa. We do it for more than 10 years now, and you're totally right. The distribution rates there are quite low. So 90% of the voluntary carbon offsetting from private clients, it's done by our My Climate website. So think about in today's world with all the Amazon, all the digitalized service, customers they buy the product in one shop, leave the shop, and go to another shop, give all the details again, give all the payment details, and do the offsetting on our webpage. So, and how can we change this situation? And I think this is what I meant with commodity. It's not easy, it's not accessible, it's not comfortable right now to offset. You have to make it an integral part of the booking system, one tick box, clearly communicated, so with one extra service for the clients, I think you can increase these participation rates. And focusing maybe what you said on EasyJet, they really took a bold step. What they did with the offset of all the emissions they did it for their customers, so they wasted a lot of money. You can absolutely question the projects behind it, but from the general message outside, it's strong and a bold message. And I think we need to discuss who has to take on the responsibility. Is it the airlines, the providers only, or is it also the responsibility of the customers, or maybe it's both?
Hi, it's Adam Moore here from New Scientist. I had a couple of questions, which follow on from the last ones actually. Just on the first point about the aviation taxes, I mean, doesn't that also, your pitch there seems to basically assume that no regions sort of club together, so your example of the person taking the training, how does your scenario work when a few European countries do that? I don't see how that works. Just following up from the first gentleman's question there. And then on the offsetting, to do more broad on the EasyJet stuff, I mean, do you see that as being part of the start of a broader trend of more airlines taking onus off passengers and offsetting all their flights? And also, specifically on EasyJet, I think they talked about having securing some price of around £3 a tonne of CO2, given what the EU ETS is like, what, 20-something a tonne euros. Is that credible? Are the projects behind that credible, Kai, or do you think that they are? You seem to allude to that bit.
Take the second question first, right?
Okay, yeah, so on the EasyJet and on the credibility of the project. So so EasyJet, as far as I know, so they have a project mix of projects from 2 standards. So they have UNC and Gold Standard, which is very good, which has high standards, and they have also ECS. And for some ECS projects, you can question some of the eligibility, the SDG. So I didn't dive into these concrete projects. I could hardly find information on these concrete projects. So as you said, £3 per ton of CO2 is very, very cheap. So I don't want to compare it to junk bonds because I think this is a strong message EasyJet gave out, and I have to give them kudos for that. But anyway, we have to focus on high quality standards, because if we start a discussion like that, is there real climate action, is there effective project behind it, then we really put a damage on the whole system. So this wouldn't help. So anyway, it's a bold step, and it costs a lot of money, but I think you cannot guarantee additional high quality projects for £3 per ton.
Yeah, no, going back to that point, and I agree with you. If you start expanding, I would say, the scope of a tax, obviously you reduce the risk of leakage. That's fair enough. What is interesting to note is that in ICAO, when Corsia, which wasn't Corsia yet, was being considered, there were different options on the table. One option was an offsetting scheme. One option would have been a global emissions trading scheme. The third option was a global tax. And what the analysis showed is that when you look at it from a CO2 perspective, the offsetting scheme was actually the one that would have delivered the greatest reductions. So I think that's really one of the big challenges, even assuming that a tax has the effects of cutting demand and so on, you do not have any quantified targets that can be set for a tax. You don't know as a regulator that if you set a tax, you will reduce emissions by X tons. You have no guarantee. It may work, it may not work. Do you want to take that risk, given the urgency? I'm not sure. If you can have a mechanism such as an offsetting scheme or an emissions trading scheme where you have quantified targets that have to be met whatever the cost, then you naturally lean towards them instead of taking the more arbitrary choice.
Fortunately, we've run out of time. We're going to move on to the next panel discussion, but if you could join me in thanking our speakers, and they're available, obviously, for further questions and discussion.